On Halloween night in a small, secluded town in Oregon, a chilling legend whispered through the trees and across the fields. Locals called it the Curse of the Abandoned House, and everyone knew the story of the haunted cabin at the edge of the forest, its windows broken and door forever creaking in the wind. They claimed the house was alive, cursed by the spirits of an old family who once lived there. Strangely, every Halloween, the ghostly light from its windows would flicker, and every few years, someone went missing, leaving the town with more questions than answers. Megan and her friends had heard the tale their entire lives. They didn't believe in ghosts, but they were drawn to the mystery. So, on that crisp Halloween night, they gathered flashlights, stuffed their backpacks with snacks, and dared each other to finally enter the house. No one had ever come back with proof, only stories of strange noises, scratching sounds, and shadowy figures. They wanted more than rumors. They wanted to confront whatever was inside. As they approached the house, the air grew unnaturally cold. The forest was deathly silent, the usual chirping of crickets and rustling of leaves absent, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Megan's friend Kyle muttered that they should turn back, but she only grinned, pushing open the door with a loud creak. The floorboards groaned under their weight as they stepped inside. Shadows seemed to dance along the walls, moving in unnatural ways, and an odd smell hung in the air, a mix of mildew, decay, and something sweeter, like rotting fruit. The friends ventured deeper into the house, illuminating old furniture draped with dusty sheets, strange stains on the walls, and marks that looked like claw scratches on the wooden floor. Just as they were beginning to laugh at themselves, dismissing the legend as nothing more than a small-town myth, they heard a faint sound from upstairs. It was like a whisper, low and unintelligible. At first, they thought it might be the wind, but then it grew louder, distinct. It was a child's voice whispering the same sentence over and over. "Come and play, come and play, come and play." Fear gripped their chests, but curiosity kept them moving. As they climbed the narrow staircase, the boards cracked underfoot, and the air thickened with an unearthly chill. When they reached the second floor, they noticed the wallpaper had dark, peeling edges, and each room's door hung slightly ajar. The whispering grew louder, seeming to come from a room at the end of the hallway. Megan took the lead, her heart pounding as she pushed open the door. Inside was a small, dusty room, and in the middle, a single rocking chair moved back and forth, though there was no one there to push it. Megan's flashlight flickered, and for a split second, she saw a figure in the corner, a young girl with matted hair and hollow, black eyes, staring straight at her. Megan froze, her voice caught in her throat. The girl's mouth stretched into an unnaturally wide smile as she whispered again, louder this time, "Come and play." Megan stumbled backward, and the others, finally seeing the girl, let out screams, but the door slammed shut behind them. They rushed to open it, but it wouldn't budge, as if an invisible force held it tight. The whispers grew into mocking laughter, filling the air, each voice overlapping in a disturbing symphony. The rocking chair stopped suddenly, and the figure of the girl began to move toward them, gliding soundlessly over the floor. Desperate, Kyle threw his shoulder against the door, finally breaking it open. They rushed down the hall and stumbled down the stairs, gasping for breath. But the house wasn't done with them. As they reached the ground floor, the rooms began to change. The furniture shifted, the walls seemed to bleed, and the temperature dropped further until their breaths hung in the air. In the doorway stood the ghostly figure of a man, tall, with hollow eyes that stared right through them. His face was frozen in a grimace of agony, and he pointed a bony finger toward the basement. "You can't leave until you've seen what you've done." A compulsion, stronger than any of their fears, pulled them toward the basement door. They didn't want to go, but their feet moved against their will. As they descended the stairs, the stench of decay grew stronger. At the bottom, they saw something that made their stomachs lurch. A collection of bones, all piled together, mixed with fragments of children's toys and torn clothes. Kyle gagged, clutching his stomach. Suddenly, the basement door slammed shut, trapping them in total darkness. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, filling the air with voices of those who had been there before them. It was a cacophony of lost souls begging for release, trapped forever in the curse of the abandoned house. And then they heard footsteps behind them. One by one, they turned, their flashlights barely cutting through the thick darkness. The man from upstairs appeared, his face more grotesque, his hollow eyes dripping with blood. "Join us," he rasped, his bony hand reaching out. The door was sealed tight. There was no way out. Hours later, when the sun finally rose, the townspeople found Megan and her friend's backpacks scattered on the steps of the old house. Inside, there was no trace of them, only an old rocking chair in the middle of an empty room, slowly moving back and forth. The legend of the abandoned house had claimed more souls that Halloween night, and for years to come, people would swear they could still hear the laughter of children, whispering, "Come and play." It was past midnight, the last night of October. A heavy fog rolled in, covering the small rural town of Whispering Pines, where a thick forest surrounded an old cemetery known for its grim legends. The townsfolk warned outsiders not to visit at night, especially on Halloween because of the Wraith of Whispering Pines. No one knew exactly what it was, only that it appeared to those foolish enough to venture into the cemetery after dark, and those who saw it rarely made it back. Emma was new in town, a college student who scoffed at ghost stories and thrill-seeking tales. She was out for a Halloween adventure, hoping to capture something spooky on her camera for her blog. Her friends had backed out, their nerves getting the better of them, but she went alone, confident she'd come back with eerie photos to show off. As she made her way through the misty forest, the temperature dropped suddenly. Emma wrapped her scarf tighter, her breath hanging in clouds as she walked. The entrance to the cemetery loomed ahead, ancient and covered in tangled ivy. She felt the first hint of unease, but she pushed forward, brushing aside broken branches as she reached for her camera. The headstones were old and cracked, names and dates barely visible, some dating back over 2 centuries. She tried to ignore the creeping silence, the way the fog seemed to press in closer, dampening every sound. She was alone, or so she thought, until she saw movement out of the corner of her eye, a shadow, tall and thin, moving between the graves. Emma spun around, trying to spot it with her flashlight, but there was nothing there, just mist shifting around the stones. She forced a laugh, trying to brush off her nerves, but then she heard something, a faint scratching sound coming from behind her, as if nails were scraping against stone. Her breath caught, and she turned slowly, her flashlight flickering as she swept it across the graveyard. The scratching stopped. With trembling hands, she raised her camera and took a picture, hoping it was only an animal. The flash lit up the darkness for a split second, revealing the figure again. It stood far off at first, partially hidden in the fog, a shadowy, twisted form with limbs too long and a face that was just wrong. Its mouth was stretched impossibly wide, its eyes nothing more than dark hollows staring right at her. She stumbled back, feeling the cold seep into her bones. She wanted to run, but her legs felt like lead. The figure moved closer, gliding, barely making a sound. She blinked, and it was closer. Blinking again, and it was closer still, hovering now over a nearby grave, its skeletal hands stretching out toward her. A voice filled her head, cold and hissing. "Join us. Stay forever." Her heart pounded as she realized this was no ordinary apparition. This was the Wraith. She turned and bolted toward the exit, not daring to look back. She stumbled through the mist, gasping for air, her flashlight casting wild beams across the trees. But the forest had changed, paths twisting and turning, no longer familiar. Every time she thought she found her way out, she'd stumble back onto the same path, as if the cemetery itself were pulling her back. Then she heard it, a steady crunch of footsteps behind her, unhurried, following her every move. She fought the panic clawing at her throat, glancing over her shoulder. The Wraith was there, gliding just behind her, whispering her name in a chilling, echoing voice. "Emma, Emma, come back." Her legs burned as she pushed herself forward, finally breaking through the trees. The cemetery was behind her now, but the footsteps were still there. She didn't stop running until she reached her car, fumbling with her keys, breath coming in gasps as she climbed inside and locked the doors. She tried to catch her breath, glancing up at the rearview mirror, and then she saw it. In the back seat, the Wraith stared back at her, its eyes like black pits, its mouth stretching into a sinister, toothless grin. The last thing she heard was its voice whispering, "Join us, forever." The next morning, the townsfolk found her car abandoned on the side of the road, her camera on the passenger seat. Her friends went through the photos, scrolling past grainy images of graves and shadows, but the last photo made them freeze. It was Emma, standing beside the wraith, her eyes dark and empty, her face twisted in terror. In the fog of the whispering pines, if you listened close enough, you could hear Emma's faint voice, forever whispering through the trees, warning others to turn back before it was too late. A storm was rolling in over the town of Ravenswood on Halloween night. The streets were empty, save for the occasional gust of wind that sent leaves scattering. It was the perfect night for a horror story, or so young Trevor thought as he read through his collection of urban legends. He had his friends with him, Olivia, Max, and Jordan, huddled together in his basement, daring each other to tell a story scarier than the last. But Olivia had an idea. She pulled out her phone and explained that her grandmother, who had grown up in Ravenswood, had always warned her about an evil eye, curse, a strange superstition that supposedly haunted the old neighborhood they lived in. According to the legend, a woman named Marion died years ago in a mysterious fire, leaving behind only a single eye-shaped stone that locals claimed was her talisman, cursed to watch anyone who dared touch it. Everyone laughed nervously as Olivia continued, saying the stone supposedly still existed, hidden somewhere in the abandoned mansion across town. It was just a story, but that didn't stop them from feeling a chill. Fueled by Halloween daring, Trevor suggested they go find it, just for a thrill. And despite their reservations, they all agreed, piling into Trevor's old car and heading toward the mansion. As they pulled up, the storm finally broke, rain beginning to pour, casting the place in an eerie gloom. The mansion loomed over them, its windows dark and cracked, ivy crawling up the walls like fingers reaching for the sky. They crept inside, the air thick with mildew and dust. Each step creaked as they moved from room to room, the only light coming from their flashlights. The deeper they went, the more the atmosphere changed. It felt as though someone or something was watching them. Finally, they found it, a small, locked room at the back of the mansion. Trevor forced the door open, and there, sitting on a rotting wooden table, was the stone. It was pale, with a strange dark spot in the center that looked unnervingly like a pupil watching their every move. As if in a trance, Olivia walked forward and picked it up, despite Max and Jordan's protests. But as soon as she touched it, the air in the room grew heavy, and the door slammed shut behind them. Olivia tried to drop the stone, but her hand seemed frozen around it. Her breathing became shallow, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at the dark pupil on the stone. Max tried to help her, grabbing her arm, but the stone's gaze seemed to shift, its dark center now glaring at him, and a strange sense of dread washed over him. He let go, stumbling backward, feeling as if he'd been burned. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against them from all sides. Then Olivia's voice broke the silence, trembling as she whispered, "She's here. She's watching us." Her face contorted in terror as her hand, still clutching the stone, began to rise against her will. She screamed, trying to fight it, but the stone had a hold on her, and it was pulling her toward the center of the room. Trevor, desperate, tried to yank open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were sealed tight, the walls trapping them in. A low whisper filled the room, a voice crackling like fire and smoke. You wanted to see. You wanted to know. The stone's eye seemed to glow, a sickly, otherworldly light that painted the room in a dim glow. And then they saw her, a figure, charred and skeletal, with hollow eyes and clawed hands emerging from the shadows, her gaze locked onto Olivia, her mouth twisting into a smile of pure malice. "Thank you for finding my eye," the ghost rasped, her voice a chilling mix of anger and joy. Her burned fingers reached out, hovering over Olivia's face, attached as if inspecting her, deciding her fate. "You'll be the first to join me, and then your friends will follow." Olivia tried to scream, but no sound came out as the ghost hand reached for her. Her skin began to pale, her body frozen as if her life was being drained into the stone. Trevor, Max, and Jordan could only watch in horror, rooted in place by an invisible force. In a desperate attempt, Trevor threw his flashlight at the ghost, breaking whatever spell held them. The flashlight shattered, filling the room with flickering light, and the ghost screamed, dissolving back into the shadows. They grabbed Olivia, who was barely able to walk, and broke through the door, running out of the mansion and into the pouring rain. They didn't stop until they were back in Trevor's basement, drenched and shaking. Olivia's hand was empty. The stone had vanished. They looked at each other, breaths ragged, knowing they'd escaped something that was beyond their understanding. But as they began to calm down, Trevor noticed something that made his stomach drop. On Olivia's wrist was a faint, red mark, shaped like an eye, staring right at him, and slowly she began to laugh, a low, unsettling laugh that sounded nothing like her own. The curse of the evil eye had found its new host, and they knew that it was only a matter of time before she, too, would be drawn back to that haunted mansion. The friends would never be free, for the Eye of Marion watched them all, waiting patiently, and it never blinked. The storm raged as Ethan pulled up to the deserted roadside motel. It was late, his eyes heavy from hours on the road, and he could barely make out the flickering neon sign in the rain-soaked night. Redwood Inn. Desperate for rest, he checked in with the night clerk, a strange, silent man who handed him the key to room 13 without a word. Ethan shrugged off the creepy vibe and made his way to the room, determined to get a few hours of sleep before continuing his journey in the morning. Room 13 was just as run down as the rest of the place, peeling wallpaper, an old tube TV, and a bed that looked like it hadn't been changed in years. But he was too tired to care. He tossed his bag on the floor and collapsed onto the bed, hoping to get comfortable. As he drifted off, he heard a faint scratching sound, like nails against wood, coming from somewhere within the room. His eyes snapped open, but everything was silent. Brushing it off as his imagination, he closed his eyes again. A loud bang jolted him awake sometime later. He shot up, heart pounding, staring at the shadows in the room. The noise had come from the closet, its door slightly ajar, dark and foreboding. He got out of bed and crept toward it, the hairs on his neck standing up. But when he flung the door open, it was empty. Just a few coat hangers swaying slightly as if recently disturbed. Telling himself it was nothing, Ethan closed the closet door and got back into bed, switching off the light. He lay in silence, listening to the rain pounding against the window, the wind howling outside. But just as he was starting to drift off, he felt it. The unmistakable sensation of someone watching him. Slowly, he turned his head toward the corner of the room, his eyes adjusting to the darkness. And then he saw her. A figure stood there, almost blending into the shadows. She was thin, with long, dripping hair hanging over her face, her clothes torn and dirty. Her eyes glowed a sickly yellow, wide and unblinking, fixed right on him. Her mouth twisted into a twisted, unnatural grin, and as Ethan tried to scream, his voice caught in his throat. The figure took a step forward, her movements jerky and unnatural, her limbs bending at odd angles. She whispered his name, her voice soft and raspy, but somehow it filled the room, echoing off the walls. Ethan scrambled backward, his hand fumbling for the light switch, but nothing happened. The lamp on the nightstand remained dark, the room drenched in darkness. She was closer now, inches from his bed, her face just barely illuminated in the faint light from the window. "Get out," she hissed, her voice full of rage. "You don't belong here." Ethan bolted out of the bed, his heart racing as he stumbled toward the door. But as he reached for the handle, he felt a cold, bony hand clamp down on his shoulder. He twisted around and she was right there, her face mere inches from his, her yellow eyes boring into his. He felt paralyzed, unable to move as she leaned closer, whispering, "You'll never leave." In a burst of adrenaline, he broke free and yanked the door open, racing down the corridor. He didn't stop running until he reached the lobby, bursting through the door, gasping for breath. The night clerk looked up from his desk, unfazed, as if he had seen this before. "Room 13, Ethan panted. "There's something in there. A woman." The clerk's face remained blank as he shook his head slowly. "Room 13? There hasn't been a room 13 here in years," he said, his voice flat and uninterested. "They shut it down after the incident." Ethan's mind reeled. What incident? The clerk's eyes shifted to a faded photo on the wall. It showed a young woman with long, dark hair smiling next to the motel's sign. "That's her, isn't it?" Ethan whispered, recognizing the woman he had seen in his room. "She died in that room," the clerk said, finally meeting Ethan's eyes. "Horribly. People say her spirit never left. Anyone who stays there sees her, if they're lucky enough to leave, that is." Feeling the walls closing in, Ethan grabbed his bag and fled to his car, peeling out of the parking lot as fast as he could. He didn't stop driving until he was miles away, the motel nothing but a distant memory in his rearview mirror. But as he took a deep breath, trying to calm himself, he glanced at the passenger seat and froze. There, sitting beside him, was the same woman, her yellow eyes staring at him with that twisted grin, her voice echoing in his mind, "You'll never leave." No one ever saw Ethan again.